Okay, I think let's get started. Thanks everyone for those who have joined us this afternoon. It's good to see some very familiar faces as well coming for our webinar sessions. So as I was sharing earlier, this was actually the second webinar that we have of our Future Work Trends HR webinars. We did decide to start this webinar series on future work trends because much has changed in the world of HR. We wanted to help you to interpret the current trends better and be one step ahead. Today's session is on the changing employment trends in recent times and just some housekeeping before we get started. So as you can see here, this webinar is actually recorded. It will be only shared on our YouTube page. So don't worry, all your details are confidential. If you have any questions, do type them in the Q&A box. As you can see as well, the Q&A box there by the orange arrow is indicated by the orange arrow. So you can just key in any questions there so that it's easier for Maurice to see the questions as well. If you do want to ask any questions verbally, do raise your hand as well, and then we'll give you permission to talk. We will be launching poll questions as well throughout the session to understand you better and make it as interactive as possible. There is a survey at the end of the session as well. So it would be very helpful if you could give us any feedback as well. And lastly, of course, those who are attending this webinar are eligible for our free 2-hour HR consulting session. And with that, I'll hand it over to Maurice here, who is our HR consultant. So Maurice, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Puditi. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my talk on changing employment trend. It's good to see some of you back. Have been attending my webinar. So for those who are first time attending my webinar, let me tell you a little bit more about myself before I jump into the session. I used to be a HR director, working in the corporate world before I moved into HR consulting. I have about 38 years of HR experience covering the full spectrum of HR, and also has good exposure to the regional Asia Pacific region. I was a HR consultant for the last 4 to 5 years, working in Myanmar as well as in Singapore. And I've been exposed to various industries, from IT to engineering, healthcare, manufacturing, oil and gas, retail, etc. Currently, I'm a HR consultant with NuVista Technology. Now, a little bit about today's talk. I'll be covering a little bit about the changing trend, and especially the Great Resignation. There's this new term that has been called in US, and everybody's asking, what is the Great Resignation and how is it affecting the employment trend? So I'll talk a little bit about that. And I will also cover the needs of Millennials and Gen Z, how you manage and engage freelancer, because this group of people are increasing in our time, and we need to manage them well. I also talk about how to manage the changing employment trend in an organization, and I'll end out with how we can help you. So first, a little bit about NuVista. NuVista was established in 2002. It is a leading provider of cloud-based integrated IT solution. It is an Oracle NetSuite solution provider since 2012. And up to today, they have implemented more than 100 over systems in more than 10 countries in Southeast Asia and Middle East. In 2015, NuVista started to develop a HRM system called NuSmart. Today, they have implemented more than 30 customers across 10 countries. And the HRMS comprises of various modules covering recruitment, payroll, leave, employees data, training and development, performance management, expense claims, etc., etc. On top of the HRMS system, New Vista also provide HR consulting services and payroll outsourcing. So for those who are interested in any of these services, please reach out to UDT. So let me jump into the topic now about the changing employment trend and the Great Resignation. Now, as mentioned earlier, a new set of people has joined the workforce, and many organizations around the world are facing with high staff turnover because of mismanagement. When I talk about the new set of people, are referring to the younger generation workforce, where we call them Millennials and Generation Z. In 2001, last year, US witnessed a record number of people leaving their job, and some management gurus are terming this event as the Great Resignation. Some mention that the spike of the resignation, the increase of the resignation, is due to COVID-19, while others believe it is due to a shift in the employment trend because of the younger workforce. Let's take a look at home. In Singapore, is Singapore also facing the Great Resignation? Well, figures from the Ministry of Manpower indicated that overall our monthly labor turnover rate in 2021 was about 1.7% as compared to the pre-COVID-19 in 2018-2019, which was also relatively low. So I'm happy to say in Singapore, we don't see a great jump in resignation. The highest staff turnover is in the F&B and security industry, which record about 3.4%, followed by the cleaning and landscaping industry at 3.3%. But in terms of white collar, the administrative or office staff, the industry that faces the highest staff turnover is the IT, which record at 2.5%. So this is still significantly low. And therefore, I can say that in Singapore, we are not facing the Great Resignation. Now, according to Gallup, an analytical and advisory company in US, the Great Resignation should be called the Great Discontent, because the studies show that the main reason employees of today are leaving is not because of the industry, it's not because of COVID, it's not because of pay issue. The main reason is due to disengagement and discontentment. This is what they have found after doing a survey across many people who have resigned. So I have mentioned that people have resigned, especially the younger workforce. Many organizations have failed to understand their needs. What about us in this part of the world? Do we know what are the needs of the younger generation, the people that we call Millennials and Gen Z? Many of these young people are feeling that the employers, the companies that they are working with, are not listening to them, nor understand their needs and expectations. So what are their needs and expectations? I'll launch a poll now and would like you all to answer the question, which do you think, okay, are the needs of the younger employees. When I talk about the youngest employees, I'm talking about the Millennials and the Gen Z. So what are the younger employees looking for in their employment? Is it higher salary, flexible work arrangement, career progression, training opportunity, all of the above? Well, for those who says all of the above, which 75% of you did, you are correct. Okay, you are correct. Today, the younger generation are looking at many things: higher salary, flexible work arrangement, career progression, training opportunity, and so forth. All right. So I have a diagram here to tell you what they are looking for. Okay. First thing is, okay, they want a good work-life balance. They want flexible working hours and able to work remotely. They want to have a sense of meaning in their work. They want to be paid fairly for their contribution. They're also looking at company culture. They want to be inclusive, okay, into planning of company strategy, work plan, etc. They want to be developed further in their professional development. So providing training to them is key. They also look at career progression. They would like to see themselves moving up their career every 2-3 years. If you try to promote a younger generation, after 5 years, 6 years, you will never have them in your organization. They will leave. They are very impatient. They want to be involved. They want to participate in every decision making, in projects. So these are things that the younger generation today is looking at. Why are they like that? Why are they different from the older generation, the baby boomers, okay, and Gen X and Gen X? Why are they different from the other group of people, the senior people? Well, in those older days, okay, the parents are not that well educated. So they work, when they get a job, they are very happy. They work long hours and they are very loyal to the organization. They want to make sure that they work hard, were able to earn a good income, a good salary to provide for their children. They don't mind the hard work. They don't mind the different kinds of work given to them. And they are not afraid to sacrifice long hours in the office. But today, the younger generation are different. They are financially, in terms of security, it's there provided by their parents and grandparents. So they are not worried of not having a job. So because of that, they look at different things. They look at the meaning of work. They want to look at professional development. They want to look at participation and so forth. And if they don't get that, they will resign. They are not afraid of not having a job, not having working for 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. They don't mind going without a job for a long period because they know that their parents can support them. So that is the younger generation. So the trend of the young generations, okay, First thing is they look at how they see themselves. When they go to work, they will ask them, what's the job? What's it in for me? What do I benefit from this job? Will I be able to learn new things? Will I be able to develop myself in this organization? Will I be able to get promoted in next 1-2 years? And so forth. And they want the organization to treat them like a human being, to respect them, to ensure that they are involved and projects and participates in decision making. They also want recognition. They are very impatient. They expect that if they contribute well, they should be rewarded immediately. So if they have been performing well in the last 1-2 years, they expect to be promoted. And these people cannot live without technology. They are very tech savvy, and they want to use technology for all their work and communication. And they feel that with technology, they can work anywhere, anytime, and not only in the office. So that's why they prefer to work remotely or in a hybrid arrangement. So this technology has helped organization, but at the same time has caused a lot of disruption. Today, people does not walk up to their colleagues' desk, work desk to talk. They will use WhatsApp and message their colleagues, which is just 2 tables away. They don't even pick up the call to make a phone call. Everything is done through social media, WhatsApp, Facebook, Messenger, etc. It's all using technology. So the way we manage these people has to be different. And one surprising trend, changing trend in Singapore is what I call the freelancer. People who work on a freelance basis. They are not tied down to an organization. A survey from Ministry of Manpower shows that from 2019 to 2020 in Singapore, there was an increase of about 17,000 people moving into freelance work. When I talk about freelance work, I'm not sure for those participants who was with me the last time in my last webinar when I talk about different type of employment, part-time, full-time, and I mentioned about freelance, where these people are under contract for service. They are not your employee. And we can see last year or the previous year, there was an increase in freelance. And with the COVID, I would say 2021, the number will be even higher. And surprisingly, the increase is not from the mature employees who were retrenched or terminated. A big part comes from people who are 30 years and below. We saw a 9% increase in 2020. And also, surprisingly, it is these young people with tertiary education, a diploma and degree. The increase went up by about 2% from 2019 to 2020. So this trend is something that HR needs to be aware of. Young people are not afraid to go into doing freelance work, they will not hesitate. Why are they going into freelance work? Well, there are some reasons. One, they prefer to work with multi-organization so that they can get greater exposure to different kinds of work challenges. So by working with 2-3 companies at the same time, doing project work or doing certain tasks, activities, they get more challenges. They are not tied down to the desk, desk bound. And also they were able to select the right company to work for. So while working with different companies on small projects, they can observe, they can feel whether the company is good for them. If it is, who knows, they may turn into full-time employee. If they find that the companies are not what they are looking for, doesn't have the kind of culture that they like, doesn't provide them with opportunity, then they may not join the company or accept further projects. So I have freelancers, they get a chance to talk to full-time employees, etc. And this is the time where they will size up the company. And also working on as a freelance, they have greater flexibility in their working hours and also the work location. And as I mentioned, freelance are on contract for service. So for those who are new to my webinar, is there a difference between contract for service and contract of service? Well, yes, for full-time, part-time, permanent, temporary contract, here the contract here, I'm talking about fixed-term contract, 1-year contract, 2-year contract. These are contract of service where they are given an employment contract and they are covered under the Employment Act. Freelance, they are contractors, they are not employees, and they are given a contract for service and they are not covered under the Employment Act. Okay. And the contract of service and the contract for service, the relationship is different. And this was mentioned during my last webinar when I was talking about Employment Act. I just want to go through quickly again. An employment contract, there's always an employer-employee relationship, while a contract for service is a client-contractor. And contract of service, employee does business for the employer, whilst the contractor carries business on his own account. I already mentioned about who is covered under the Employment Act. And for contract of service, for those who are under employment contract, there are certain employment terms that you have to follow under the labor law. Whereas for contract for service, the Employment Act, the statutory benefit do not apply to them. Okay. And there are ways to test the situation, whether you are contract for service or contract of service. And this again was mentioned in my employment webinar. So for those who did not attend, just to let you know, there are 3 types: the control test, the integration test, the economy reality test. So by doing these 3 tests, you will be able to determine whether the person falls under a contract of service or a contract for service. Again, all these I will cover in detail during my 1-day Employment Act workshop. Of course, as more and more people go into freelance work, the freelancer also do face challenges. And one of the main challenges is trying to keep track of their own account work, their own finances. Okay. How much time they spend on the work. because some of them needs to send their invoices, okay, to the company to claim for their fee. They are paid by projects, workman hours, based on man hours. So keeping track of their time, their hours worked, justifying what they do is sometimes a big challenge to the freelancer and the organization. But luckily with today's technology, this issue can be minimized. Sometimes it could be due to insufficient work or trying to find work. Another few other concerns or challenges faced by freelancer are healthcare related issues, retirement related concern, because as freelancer, there is no CPF contribution for them from the organization. If they are paid a fee. So without CPF contribution, they will suffer in future if they have major illness and need hospitalization. There may not be sufficient fund in their MediSave account. And of course, for those younger generation, if they want to get married, they want to apply to buy HDB flats, they may not have enough CPF fund. So these are concerns. So on the organization, if your organization do engage freelance, okay, or planning to go into freelance, engaging freelancers, please do give some thoughts to these people. Yes, they can help the organization to reduce costs, the labor costs, but at the same time, companies must also take care of these people and treat them like your employees. So something that I can suggest to organization who has freelancer or intending to use freelance, besides paying them a fee for their work done, they can also provide some form of financial support for training. Of course, in Singapore, we do have a lot of grants from the Skill Future to help Singaporean and PR with their training, even without company support. Okay, the government still provide a lot of support to individuals to take up courses. Do give them bonuses if they do well, if they complete project on time or ahead of time. They will very much appreciate. And though as a freelance under contract for service, a company need not have to pay CPF for these people, but sometimes an organization can help to do voluntary CPF contribution. So this is something that companies can help to put in to the freelancer CPF account through voluntary contribution. And of course, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, one of the major concerns is medical. So companies may want to take up medical insurance for this group of people as well, so that they can claim their medical expenses, and do give them paid time off, okay, especially for those freelance who has to work 5 days work week for your organization. So it's good to give them some time off, but if there is freelancer that is working on a flexible work arrangement, not on full working hours, 5 days a week or 6 days a week, then paid time off may not be necessary. Company must also know what drives this freelancer, why they want to work as freelance, which I've mentioned, flexibility, choice, and timing. Okay. So to be aware of what drives people, younger people, to take up freelance work. And also more importantly is communication. Employees do promote a lot of two-way communication with their full-time employees. But when it comes to freelancer, sometimes the communication is lagging. So it's good that companies must get the freelance into the team and form chat group to get the full-time employees to communicate with freelancer. So with today's technology, WhatsApp, Instagram, Messenger, communication is easy. You don't need to pick up the phone and make a call. You don't need to have conference. Everything can be done through group chat platform. And as freelancer, they are working on multiple projects with multiple organizations, some of them. It is important that organization, when they schedule meetings, it is good to plan ahead to let the freelancer know when you schedule a meeting. They do need to plan their own schedule. And also it's good to avoid after office hour to contact the freelancer. Yes, they are freelancer, but that doesn't mean they are at your exposure anytime. So it's best continue working with them during office hour. Because freelancer, one of their main concern is they want flexible working hours. They want work-life balance. So managers in organization need to recognize that. Another thing is that, okay, companies needs to provide feedback to freelance people as well. As an they may not be your full-time employee, but companies still has the responsibility to give feedback to freelance on their performance and to share information and to give them guidance and tips on further improvement and development. Because they are exposed to various organizations more than your full-time employees, it is also good to ask them for suggestion, for help on projects or on recommendation to make your organization be a better organization. Treat them with respect and they can provide you with more information than you know. And of course, finally, do provide resources and support to these people. Do understand that, okay, sometimes their resources may be limited. So do provide them with resources such as laptop or internet connectivity if you know that they are from developing countries and so forth. But of course, in Singapore, we may not have the issue of internet connectivity. Even with freelancer, when you engage freelancer, it's always good to tie your freelance with a full-time employee, what I call a buddy system. Okay. It's just like a newcomer. Okay. Always have a buddy, a full-time and a freelance. So that in case of any issue that the freelancer have, any queries, any question that or doubts that the freelance person may have, they can always approach the buddy instead of the manager or supervisor. So sometimes they will feel much easier. They don't have that stress to talk to managers and so forth, or to get hold of the managers. So these are some of the things that you can do for freelancer. Now, besides freelance, okay, the changing employment trend is one of them is freelancer. On top of that, okay, as I mentioned, more and more younger generation are joining the workforce, and the expectation, their needs are very much different from the more mature employees who are in their 50s or 60s. These younger people, they are more educated, more aggressive, more tech savvy, and they will not hesitate to resign, to jump from one organization to another. In the past, if you have your resume and if you have not been working for a company for more than 5 years, 3 to 5 years, you are considered a job hopper. Today, if you look at resume of younger people, most of them is 1 year, 2 year. Okay? And that doesn't mind because they are learning. They want to gain and learn. So they don't mind moving from one organization to another. So as HR, how do you manage these people to make sure that they don't jump from one organization to another organization? How do we retain them? Okay. I have 5 key points that I want to touch on as HR. What you can do to ensure that you retain employees, especially the younger generation. First, be fair. Second, be engaged. Third, be flexible. Fourth, be forward. And fifth, be empathic. Let me elaborate further. When I say be fair, as an organization, please be fair in terms of the pay. Younger generation, they are very concerned about their salary. They want to make sure that they are getting a salary that is fair to them and is aligned with the market. And today, to get salary information, it's very easy. It's not like in the past where we were struggling to contact our friends to make comparison. Today, you just go to a search engine, Google, and you just type in, what is the salary for an engineer with a degree? You will get tons and tons of information. So younger generation, they know how much their position is worth. So pay them according to the market. Don't shortchange them. Second, respect them. Okay? They are more educated. They have been doing a lot of reading from the internet. They know what's happening around the world. So they are very knowledgeable. So as an organization tap on these people, on their knowledge. They are not like older workers where we have only maybe secondary education, a diploma. Getting a degree in the early days was very rare and difficult. And therefore, in terms of knowledge, many of us are limited. But today, younger generation, 8 out of 10 will all be at least having a tertiary education, at least a diploma or a degree. And all of them are very knowledgeable. They know what's going on. Be fair. If they do well, do promote them, give them advancement. So in your organization, it is important that you have a career progression, a career path developed to attract and motivate the younger generation. Don't be afraid to share with them the career path, the career ladder. I know of some organizations, the HR, they develop the career job grading, the career path with 12 job grades and salary ranges. And they don't share. The HR hide it among themselves and only share with line managers. No one else knows. I was surprised. Then in that way, how do you motivate? How do you retain employee if you don't share such information to get these people excited that there are opportunities in organization? They should consider your organization without looking outside. So do share with your employees the career path. Next, be engaged. As I mentioned, the younger generation, they want to participate, they want to be involved. They want to know what is going on in the organization. So do share information about the organization. Don't hide. There is no secret. Everything can be searched in the using technology today. So it is important that organizations share information with employees. Let them know firsthand. Let them know what's going on. And do communicate with them in terms of asking them, telling them and asking them. Okay? By telling them, you share. And by asking them, you ask for suggestion, for ideas on how to make the company a better place, how to improve or increase the productivity or sales revenue or profitability. Bear in mind, as I mentioned, younger generation are more well educated. So they know, they have friends, and it's good to tap on these people for new ideas. And these young people, many of them, think outside the box. They can give you ideas that you have never thought of. Always take regular pulse of the company. That is, do employee surveys regularly to find how employees feel about the organization. Do not wait until too late when employees start to resign, to leave the organization one by one. Then you can take the survey. It's too late. Do it, be proactive. Take the survey. Conduct a survey once now and then, at least once a year, to see if there's any change, any improvement in the company's interaction with the employees or initiative or activities and so forth. Do allow feedback and suggestion, don't kill it. Allow employees to come up with fresh idea, encourage them. Do have meetings, and when in meetings, do allow employees to bring up ideas, to give feedback and so forth. And if it's good, if this idea is good, the suggestion is good, always reward the employee. Excuse me. When I say reward, it doesn't mean you have to give cash. It could be a small little token, a gift, a souvenir, a book. Okay, so that will be appreciated. It's the gesture. Okay. Be flexible. Okay. Younger generation, they like to work from different environment. They want work-life balance. So give them that flexibility to allow flexible work arrangement. Empowered employees, do not micromanage. Set goals, set tasks, and as long as they achieve it within the deadline given, they are good. It's considered that they perform well. Okay. Give them some room to breathe. Okay. Younger generation people hate people breathing down their neck. Okay. So they don't like that. So it's good to give them some space so that they can work well and contribute well. Just set targets, set deadline, and then follow on those. You will not go wrong. Be forward-looking. Okay? Plan ahead for succession and inform the younger generation, the younger workforce. Tell them what are the plans you have for them to move on, what they eventually be the head of department. Provide them with training and development opportunity. I remember when I talk about training and development opportunity in one of my organizations, the big bosses, oh, we don't have budget. We cannot afford training of our employees. Okay? It's expensive. Well, I tell them, training and development need not be expensive. You don't have to send your employees to a $1,000 workshop, to a $2,000 cost seminar, etc. Training can also be cheap. There are some training that are supported by the government. Make use of them. There are a long list of training programs there. Surely you can find a few that will fit the organization and they are inexpensive. Just a few $100. 100 plus, maximum 200 for 3-4 days cost. Sometimes training can be free. There are a lot of YouTube training videos which are very short, 5-10 minutes. Pick up a few and circulate among the employees to share. As HR, you should look at all those. If you find anything that talk about managing performance or decision making or team building or communication skill, these are short videos. Share with your employees. Let them watch, let them listen. And who knows, they can pick up a few tips and they can use it and improve themselves. Sometimes you can buy books. and share books, motivational books, leadership books, or even books on lead management or selling skills or accounting, etc. You can share these books with your staff who are keen to read. They doesn't mind that. Okay. And that again is not expensive. So providing training and development opportunity need not be expensive, need to have a big budget. And of course, sometimes you have coaching and mentoring, and that is also not expensive. It's in-house. And finally, as an organization, you need to ensure that you have good understanding with empathy, understand the employees, show concern to employees, make sure that they don't get burned out, they don't get stressed out, because once they find that they are very stressful, very tired, they will resign. So make sure you provide work-life balance, occasionally organize some social activities, relaxation. So I know there are some organizations that have once a month early off on Friday to have meals with your family or loved ones, okay, and so forth. And then there are some companies that allow family members to visit the office, get gathering and so forth. Of course, now with COVID, it's difficult, but after the COVID, do look at all this, where you can have work-life balance, we can have social activities to build up the spirit of the team. And with that, then you will be able to retain the employees. So managing the changing employment trend is nothing new. It's very much on engaging the employees. And this has to be done from day one onward when the employees join, all the way through, continuously, never let down. So again, communication is one of the key things. Developing your employees, be fair, respect them, get them to participate, get them to involve, ask for their help, ask for their ideas. These are all the things that you can do to make the employees feel wanted. And this is the way to retain the employee. So how can we help you? So with NuSmart, we have the HRM system that you can use to track your freelance, where you can have your attendance, you can have your project management, appraisal. This can be done with technology. If you're not sure about how to implement policies, practices for the different type of employees, full-time, part-time, freelancer, do engage us. We will help you. All right. We have the system which are available, as I mentioned, covering various modules, various HR activities, and our system is available on both web as well as mobile. So as long as anybody has a mobile phone, either iOS or Android, they are able to tap into our HRMS. For consulting, we can help you to develop, or we can help you improve, and we can cover all the different areas. And it can be on a project base, or it can be on a retainer service ongoing. All right. So this is something that we can help you. So with that, I will end my session. If anybody has any question, please type it into Q&A or raise your hand, and I'll be happy to answer. If not, there's a quick poll on how you find today's webinar. Do fill it in and submit back to us. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maurice. So if you have any questions, do feel free to put them in the chat and we'll be happy to answer them now. But as shared, as Maurice has shared also, and as you see on the screen, so there are upcoming webinars as well. The next one is actually in April, which is on managing payroll correctly. And then on the next slide, there is the employment tech course that we are holding actually next Tuesday. So if you're interested, do let us know. You can answer in the poll as well that we have launched. And we do invite you to connect with us on LinkedIn as well. So there's the HR technology community group that we have, the NuSmart LinkedIn page as well, where we are sharing updates on the initiatives and events that we have and any knowledge that we want to share about HR. If you do have any HR requirements, feel free to email me as well. I've put my email in the chat below. So I think maybe we can just wait a bit more if there's any more questions from the audience.
Don't be afraid to ask any question. If you want to reach out to me, I'm available. You can send your question through to Uditi, who will forward to me, and then I will liaise directly with you on the answer. Because sometimes even through your question, I may not be able to provide you with accurate answer unless I know the full detail. I may still need to reach out to you.
Yeah, so as you have attended this session, you are also eligible for free 2-hour HR consulting. So if you're interested, you can always reach out to me. I hope you have learned a lot from today's session. I have myself learned a lot from you, Maurice. So thanks, Maurice, for the session.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who has joined us as well, who have taken time today to join us. We hope that you have learned useful tips and hope you can implement them right away. Do drop me any message if you would like to, if you need any help. Maurice is also here if you need any help. And yeah, hope to see you for our future webinars and our courses. There is a survey at the end of this webinar, as I shared. So if you have any open-ended feedback, do feel free to drop it. It would really help us to improve our webinars and make it better for you. I think we don't have any questions. So thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, everybody. So for those who wants to leave, please go ahead.
Yeah, hope you have a great rest of the day and see you again soon.